Hello, everyone. Welcome to another commentary from King's Comments. And today we're going to review some of the information that's taken place since my last commentary on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We're also going to talk about some other issues directly related to this conflict. But let's get into the actual conflict itself. Since the last audio message that I posted, things have gotten progressively worse on the battlefield for the Ukrainian military, and I'm beginning to see a pattern develop here as it directly relates to the Russian military goals and aims on the battlefield. And much of the information that I'm getting is coming from the Telegram channels from both sides. And for anyone that does have Telegram, I would seriously suggest that if you want to get much of the information firsthand, or secondhand from myself, Telegram's the best place to get that information because it's in most cases live, and at the other situation as well, you get a very good assessment of where the battlefield is at any given moment in time. And I find that even the Ukrainian mappers are also extremely good when it comes to providing the information and providing accurate information. They're not propagandists. And that's extremely important because people need to get access to the best information at that moment in time. So let's get into it. What has happened since the last communique is that we've had more villages fall to the Russian military at different points along the point of contact, from an area in Kharkiv called Ivanivka to Staromayorsk, which is in the far south of that line of contact. We've had more and more Russian advances. We've actually had a major tank and armored advancement by the Russians in the Staromayorsk area. And who knows what the main target of that advance is likely to be, but it's a complete collapse of the Ukrainian lines. And this was to be expected in light of the fact that the Ukrainian military is stretched thin and they simply, unfortunately, don't have the capability to be able to rotate troops in and out, fresh troops, and they simply don't have the manpower to deal with this significant line of contact from the north to the south. So let's just talk about real quickly what's happening from Kharkiv all the way down. What we're noticing is specifically from a military perspective, we're starting to see the advantages of the Russian military play out in a patterned effect. So what do I mean by that? Well, the Russians are not throwing manpower, huge amounts of manpower at the Ukrainian fortified defenses, or what's left of those fortified defenses. What they're actually doing is they're using their FAB 1,500, 2,000 bombs to effect, their ODAB bombs, their Kinshal missiles, Iskander missiles, and artillery to massive effect. And they're also using the FPV drones to an increasingly alarming effect as it directly relates to Western machinery. So Western armor, a lot of this armor is very, very expensive, is simply being abandoned as well because the Ukrainian military, for whatever reason, is unaware of their own topography. There have been a lot of cases where the Ukrainian military has abandoned Bradleys, infantry, fighting vehicles, because they didn't assess the fact that there were water obstacles, water boundaries that they couldn't get over with those tanks. And at the point of contact, those tanks are being exposed and they're being destroyed. But they're being destroyed without the personnel in the tanks, because those people have basically withdrawn, evacuated, or simply just decided to leave the area because they know that the ability to win is impossible. So all along the line of contact, we're seeing the Russians employ this kind of strategy. The strategy is to, there used to be when the United States was fighting in the Gulf War, Colin Powell, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, when they were fighting in the first Gulf War, said, we're going to find it, cut it, and kill it. And, people sort of found that funny. He didn't say that. He said that with a straight face. But what the Russians are actually doing right now is they're finding it, cutting it, and killing it. And the way they're finding it is they're using their eyes in the sky to basically find their targets. The FPV drone operators can literally have these drones flying for as long as they want in the sky until they find the targets that they want to hit. And their satellites are also locating just about everything that you can think of within Ukraine proper. And the third thing, and I think this is just mind-boggling to me, is that the Ukrainians have decided that they're going to move large amounts of personnel in large formations to the field of contact without armor, thus exposing those large formations to massive losses. And what we're seeing in Volchansk, for example, in the Kharkiv Oblast area, is we're seeing this play out to effect, where the Russians are likely to take northern Volchansk here within about 2 weeks. And that's based off of a lot of people at the military summary channels, estimates, as well as even Ukrainian channels that are looking at the situation. Again, I feel very bad for the Ukrainian soldier, because the Ukrainian soldier is an extremely brave soldier for the most part. They're battle hardened, they're strong, but they simply have been let down by their armor. They've been let down by their commanders, by their senior officer corps. They've been let down by their government, and they're being thrown into these situations that are completely untenable, unwinnable, from the north to the south. So if you think about this for a moment, prior to the Russian introduction of the FAB bombs, Ukrainian fortified defenses were not that bad once they were actually employed. Remember, and I think people should remember this, in the Luhansk and Donetsk region, the Ukrainians had 10 years prior to this conflict right now to be able to prepare fortified defenses, which would have made it difficult for the Russians to actually go out and just steamroll those defenses from a military perspective, because they were well dug in, everything. But what the FAB bombs have been able to do is they've been able to eliminate these fortified defenses to the point where it's just not possible for Ukrainians to maintain trench line fortified defenses without being decimated completely. And it's forcing a lot of the Ukrainian army to be able to withdraw to cities or villages where, unfortunately, they're taking up positions in high buildings, because that's the only way that they can survey the actual battlefield. And it's creating massive casualties from all the way from Kharkiv Oblast all the way down. And it's just not working out in terms of how this thing is shaping out for the Ukrainian military. A military that's already stretched thin, a military that is kidnapping people in the streets to see if they can bring people on the front lines. Before I get to that point, I do want to say that it has been stated on the Telegram channels that the Russians are now bombing or using up to 100 FAB bombs a day in different areas of the point of contact. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, we're talking about massive, massive losses because those bombs are being used in areas where there are massive concentrations of Ukrainian military men, and they're not being used in areas that you're going to find a lack of military personnel or a large grouping of military personnel. So those bombs are being used to massive effect. The other thing that's becoming very clear here is that the Ukrainian commanders on the ground, as well as their high command, are sort of devoid of knowing what to do. So you're hearing these stories or fanciful stories of striking Russia deep into Russia. And I'm going to make 2 points about that. One, NATO is playing with fire because if they ever attempted to do that using Ukraine as a proxy for that, Ukrainian as well as NATO bases all over the world will be subject to the same sort of targeting. And that's something that NATO countries are not prepared to be able to handle because they're talking about conscription in a way that's never been talked about before at some of these, at the NATO meeting here. And none of these countries are prepared for conscription. None of their populations want it. And they're trying to broach the subject in a sort of a couched manner. And it's being completely torn down by other NATO countries who think it's absolutely ludicrous. So you've got countries, obviously, like Hungary, like Italy, that are absolutely against the idea of striking Russia with these long-range missiles. The other thing to keep in mind is that these long-range missiles, or even the thought of striking, let's just forget the fact that Russia will respond in kind. But let's just assume for a moment that the Russians said, pinprick, no big deal. If they did that, it doesn't change the situation on the battlefield for Ukraine. The Ukrainian battlefield is still going to be a quagmire for the Ukrainians. And I don't quite know what victory means for the West anymore. It was thought that victory for the West was the Ukrainians being able to get back the 4 regions and acquiring Crimea. And we all know that that particular goal is hollow. It's never going to happen. Even if they were to crawl back the gains that the Russians made during this offensive, and we still don't know how far this is going to go, it doesn't detract from the fact that there's no way that Ukraine will be able to eliminate Russia from the territories or evict Russia from the territories that they already control. So I'm not entirely certain what victory looks like. If victory is surviving this, meaning that a rump Ukrainian state continues to exist, then it would be better to sue for peace now than go out and destroy your future generations of people the way that it's being done right now by the Ukrainian government. Now, getting back to what's happening on the ground, and I think this is significant, Ukraine has asked specifically for advisors from NATO countries to be placed in Ukraine to train the new recruits that are coming in. And Dima over at the Military Summary Channel had made mention of the fact that these new recruits right now are only getting about a month and a half or less of training, and they may only know how to handle a weapon. And then they're being placed at the point of contact, and their life expectancy is about 2 days. So I want everyone to stop and think about this. The new recruits that they've just gone out and recruited, let's say it's about 120,000 men that were recruited primarily against their will. These young men have about a 2-day life expectancy, just about at any point along the line of combat contact. And they're fighting a professional army. Now, a lot has been talked about the Russian military. And I do want to make a couple of points about this that I've learned recently, and I actually learned this from watching Alexander Mercouris's broadcast. I found this very compelling because he's very connected with some of these journalists in Russia, in the sense that he's aware of some of the things that are going on that aren't being reported in the West. And one thing came to my mind here, and that is that the majority of this war up until this point has been fought by people on the Russian side from the 4 regions. So actual Russian divisions haven't really been involved. The only time that Russian divisions have been involved have been specifically this last offensive into Kharkiv. For the most part, the Russians have employed individuals like the Wagnerian forces, like the Chechen forces, like the Siberian forces. They've employed them much like a mercenary military to go out and fight and to take them to the positions that they are at right now. So if we all remember the Battle of Bakhmut, which took place in 2023, that was a meat grinder, and we're not seeing that meat grinder anymore, but that was a real meat grinder. We're not seeing those kinds of battles anymore. That was a battle that was taken by specifically PMC Wagner. Those were Wagnerian soldiers, Russian and other nationalities or ethnicities, who were fighting basically for money. And they may have had a patriotic duty, but they were being fought. That battle was being fought by people that were not regular Russian military. So what we're beginning to see is more and more regular Russian military getting involved in the conflict. There's been some talk of about 300,000 Russian combat divisions being placed somewhere close to the border of Chernihiv-Sumy area, which is adjacent to the western part of the Kharkiv offensive, where only about 10 to 14,000 Russian regular soldiers are fighting. And one Ukrainian officer on a Telegram channel, unnamed, anonymous, made mention of the fact that they can't really win in any of these conflicts that are taking place in the different lines of combat contact. And the reason for that is what I've been talking about before, which is, even if you're the most sympathetic Ukrainian observer and you want Ukraine to win and you want Ukraine to remain, you have to look at what's happening objectively, and you also have to look at the fact that there is absolutely no air support, absolutely no hope of air support. There's absolutely no satellite capabilities. There's absolutely no ability to forestall the inevitable. And the artillery disadvantage is just criminal in terms of the amount of shelling that the Russians are able to do compared to what the Ukrainians are able to do. So from a military perspective, in every area, there's major deficiencies on the Ukrainian side. You could talk about manpower, you can talk about artillery shells, you can talk about air power, you can talk about the quality of that air power, you can talk about drones. Just about every area, there's a massive gap between the capabilities of the Ukrainians and the capabilities of the Russians. Now, I would point to the fact that when it comes to the Ukrainian side, a lot of this mismanagement, aside from the fact that they just don't have those capabilities, is due to corruption. And the Ukrainian government was one of the most corrupt governments in the world prior to this conflict. And no doubt this Western military aid has provided the Ukrainian leadership in the Rada an opportunity to be able to siphon off funds for themselves and to be able to live comfortably, send their children abroad, while others and their children are forced to fight in a war that makes no sense and has no lasting benefit for the Ukrainian people. So for anyone who thinks that Ukraine's actually winning this war, it's just, you'd have to be completely ridiculous in your thought process to assume that Ukraine, as it sits right now, is winning or even close to being a stalemate. This is not a stalemate. And the fact that even someone would call it a stalemate would mean that Ukraine was still losing, because a stalemate cannot benefit a country that has much less resources from a manpower perspective than the Russians do. But this is no longer a stalemate. This is complete and total annihilation, but it's slow annihilation, meaning that, the Russian objective is to eliminate a generation of young Ukrainian men. And it's not that they want to, I think. It's just the fact that they believe that they're forced into doing it because of the fact that these men are being conscripted to fight their men. And so therefore, given the choice, Ukrainian men are going to be sacrificed for this endeavor. Now, another thing that just took place that I found very interesting was this idea of bringing Western advisors to the Ukraine. And just recently, a major missile attack, a hypersonic missile, hit a training facility in Lviv, which is southwest part of Ukraine. And I think it's southwest. I could be wrong. But this missile attack did substantial damage. And word has it that upwards of about 300 Ukrainian and foreign advisors were killed in this attack. Not much is being discussed about it in the Western media, but clearly it's an issue for it's an issue because it's being reported all over Telegram, and it's being reported by Ukrainian sources as well as Russian sources in these channels. So we don't know if French, American, or other Western partners have substantial assets killed from that strike, but one has to assume that they definitely had assets that were caught up in that strike. And this leads me to another conclusion. And I think this is something that people have to not take for granted in the context of Russian strike capabilities and their abilities to locate assets in the western part of Ukraine, which aren't at the point of contact. So let's just talk about that. Vladimir Putin is an an old KGB man. And what the Russian are very good at and have been good at for a long, long time is assets on the ground, putting assets on the ground and finding out where people are, finding out capabilities where there's a large collection of people meeting. And we heard about this attack some time ago in the Chasiv Yar region, where a Polish general was killed, as well as NATO personnel were killed in a missile attack in an underground bunker in the Chasiv Yar area. That clearly was at the point of contact, but the Russians weren't there yet. So clearly someone must have tipped them off to let them know that there were assets there that were significant enough to warrant that kind of strike immediately. And clearly that's the case here in Lviv. And what we're finding out is that there are people in all over the Ukraine that are able to spot certain things, see certain things, and provide intelligence to the Russians in terms of their targeting capabilities. We're seeing that in Lviv, obviously. We're seeing that in Odessa. We're seeing that all over the place. And I'm 100% certain that the Russians have agents everywhere that are able to assess Ukrainian capabilities, NATO capabilities, and they can blend in because Russians and Ukrainians don't look that much. They look similar. The languages are similar, and I'm sure that there's a lot of Ukrainians of Ukrainian stock that aren't for this war as well. So it would be very easy to see how people on the ground would support the reimposition of a new government, a peace deal that makes sense, and this is why this whole situation doesn't make sense to me. Now, recently, some of these NATO countries are trying to commit aid to Ukraine. And, I keep saying this and I keep saying this. Aid is not the issue for the Ukrainian military. Aid is not the issue. You can bring in as much aid as you want, which equates into more arms, but it's only going to get destroyed because of the fact that they just simply do not have the capabilities to be able to match Russian capabilities to destroy them. And we're seeing this in the Kharkiv area, where what the Russians have done is they've blown up bridges, forced the Ukrainian military's armor onto one highway, and basically picked all of them off like they're, just picking off flies or picking apples from a tree. It's just been an absolute farce. And nothing has been able to get through to the extent that it could actually make a significant dent. And this is part of the reason why the Ukrainians, when they do a counteroffensive, they can't make any headway beyond their initial gains in that counteroffensive, because their body is their armor. So they cannot push the Russians back successfully beyond where the Russians will allow them to get penned in, where these fab bombs are being used on them. And we're seeing that to great effect in Lviv. We're seeing that to great effect in Kharkiv and all along the point of contact. So from a military perspective, the ground situation for Ukraine is looking increasingly worse. And it's not going to get any better. I would expect the Russians to be able to control pretty much all of the Donetsk region, Luhansk region, Zaporozhye region here by the end of August. If this continues the way it is, I don't suspect, with the losses that the Ukrainians are taking, that they could last another year like this. I just can't see it. I do see a situation where Zelensky is replaced. And I'm beginning to sense that there's even a mutiny amongst senior officers, because if you're being yelled at by a guy who has no clue about what's going on, in all likelihood, you can get replaced fairly quickly. And that could happen. We aren't aware of the situation. Syrsky is likely to be fired. Again, I would submit that not all of this is on his plate or his fault. This has to be on Zelensky's table. And the reason why is because the buck stops with him. If you don't have fortifications in the east, your lines of defense in the east, and you were told about this impending attack, that falls on you. The fact that there were no fortifications in the east, that falls on you. The fact that people's wallets have become fat at the expense of people's lives, that falls on you. The fact that people are being rounded up in vans and being kidnapped from their cities, and then being forced to fight on the front with less than 3 months worth of training, and have a life expectancy of 2 days, that falls on you. So this isn't looking good for Ukraine. It's only getting progressively worse. I think for the West, this is a situation where they're wholly unprepared for a military escalation with Russia. Russia has the largest army, has the largest nuclear deterrent in the world, and the West is just not capable of sustaining a conflict or even entertaining the idea of a conflict despite the fact that they want to engage in this strategic ambiguity, which makes absolutely no sense. Because once their populace gets word of this, to the extent that they should, you're going to start to see major government changes here very shortly in many of the Western capitals. Now, I want to contrast what's happening in the Ukraine-Russia conflict with what's happening in the Israel-Gaza conflict. And I think there's some similarities and a whole lot of differences when it comes to how to wage war. If you notice in the Gaza conflict, what we're seeing is an inability on the part of the Israelis to inflict a decisive blow on Hamas. And the reason for that is because it's not that Hamas is fighting a conventional war. They never could and they never should, because they were simply not capable of fighting that kind of combat. But what they're doing is they're increasingly fighting a war of rearguard action, meaning that they're harassing Israeli supply lines, they're killing Israeli soldiers daily, making it expensive for Israel to stay in the Gaza and the West Bank. So it's becoming more and more of a long-term situation and long-term misery for both sides, but a political issue for the Israeli government in a way that Vietnam was for the United States. And it's also galvanized the entire global South against the West and the United States, which is extremely dangerous from the economic situation, because what it basically means is that nobody trusts them anymore. Now, this military situation with Hamas is increasingly the situation that I thought would have made more sense for Ukraine to actually deal with when it came to the Russian invasion back in 2022. What they should have done was allowed the Russians to take large cities, large swaths of territory, and try to harass their supply lines, try to make it expensive for the Russians to stay there, and make it death by 1,000 knives, or 1,000 cuts. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians decided to fight a conventional war against the world's best conventional force, and we're beginning to see the long-term ramifications of that, because the Russians were always going to turn this into a war of attrition, because their stated goal was to eliminate the Banderas, the Ukrainian nationalists, the Nazis, as they like to refer them to. Their stated goal was to eliminate the Ukrainian military as a fighting force. As we go into this, the second 2-year plus category of this conflict, they've done that. There's over 600,000 Ukrainian men that are no longer able to serve. They're dead or wounded. These are men that cannot be resurrected. And those were the initial patriots, as I said in my earlier audio message. These were the people that were willing to sign up and to go out to the front and fight the Russians, bravely, I might add. And since then, what we've seen is the Russians basically decimate battalions, brigades, to the point where these brigades cannot rotate or cannot bring in fresh recruits to replace those that they've lost. And we're at a position right now where the same thing is happening now in Kharkiv. It's almost like they don't learn from their mistakes. Now, one might take the position that, well, what else can they do? What would you do differently? Well, if I was a Ukrainian commander and I was talking to Zelensky at present, I would simply tell him that from a military perspective, that there's no way that we can win. So what we need to do is to sue for peace and try to use the western part of Ukraine as an opportunity to get into NATO. And then create another situation for the Russians, which forces them to either have to come back or forces a situation where then you've got direct confrontation with NATO. I think that's the only way, because what they're actually doing at present is they're actually endangering the whole concept of Ukraine as it exists today. Again, there's a right way and a wrong way to proceed with this. During the Vietnam War, the United States, through Henry Kissinger, their Secretary of State at the time, he negotiated with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, even while they were bombing North Vietnamese cities and even while the North Vietnamese were attacking American soldiers. So I don't understand why that's not happening. This upcoming peace summit is a joke, and I'm actually, I'm surprised at Switzerland, really, because they've tarnished their reputation and image as a so-called neutral country, because you're supposed to invite both parties to a peace conference in order to create a prospective peace settlement. They've chosen not to invite the Russian side. So this whole idea of a peace settlement is a complete abject joke and means nothing. Now the United States is likely not to attend through its president. China's not attending. So at the end of the day, it means nothing. It's a futile. It's just an opportunity for people to get together, eat food, talk big, and nothing ever happens, which is pretty much what happens at pretty much all of the NATO conferences and European Union conferences, because they can never get consensus on about anything that they talk about at present. The other issue that I want to make mention of, and I think this is the last issue, is where do we go from here? What is likely to happen if you have a crystal ball in the Russian-Ukraine conflict? What is likely to happen? Well, at one point I used to think that Russia would never wish to acquire Kiev. I'm not entirely certain anymore what Russian objectives are, because even Russian objectives are changing, and what victory looks like for them is a function of battlefield success. Originally, the Russian objective was to take the four regions, maintain a stranglehold on Crimea, and make sure that the rest of Ukraine never becomes part of NATO. That's the Russian plan. Right now, as it sits on the battlefield, the Russians are going to accomplish the first two objectives, which is to basically take all of the four provinces, all of the territories back, and maintain that stranglehold on Crimea. But as for the third issue, which is the inclusion of the western part of Ukraine into some sort of NATO alliance, I'm not entirely certain of what the Russians plan on doing there. I don't believe that the Russians trust the West anymore. I don't believe that they trust the words of the West. I don't believe that they trust any agreements from the West. I think that unless there was regime change in the Western capitals, where there was room for this kind of completely different philosophy, there might be a change of heart. Excuse me. But in Moscow right now, I simply don't see it. And that leads me to believe that there may be a regime change one way or the other in Ukraine, where Ukraine itself is changed completely. And there really isn't anything the West can do about it, other than accept it and try to grow up their own militaries. Because at this particular point in time, the French, the Germans, the British, they're talking about military conscription like their population wants to do it, or like their economies can handle it, when everybody knows it's not the case. So that leads me to believe that none of these countries in Western Europe are capable of fighting off the Russians. And those small little countries, the Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, they're just big talkers. There's nothing they can do. They're just small little countries. Poland is an interesting situation, but even Poland, There again, a lot of talk, but they're not going to poke the Russian bear to the extent that they would invite Russian missiles on their soil. That's not something that the Polish public wants in the least. So having said that, there's a lot to sort of figure out here moving forward. What does Russian victory really look like? Well, I think Russian victory is changing by the day. It depends on what they believe and who they believe they can trust in Western capitals. And right now, there isn't anyone in any of the Western capitals that's trustworthy from their perspective to negotiate a deal with. My guess is that they're likely to make decisions based off of government changes in Western capitals, and then they'll sort of surmise what their next steps are. So whether those changes take place in Berlin, in Paris, in London, or in Washington, and I expect changes in all four capitals to take place because the economies in all of those countries are in complete shambles. I would expect that what you're going to see is you're going to see more of the kind of a situation that exists right now with the government in Italy, who's taken the strong stance that while we do support Ukraine, we're not willing to take risks that involve nuclear saber rattling. So this is where we are right now. Russian victory is on the battlefield complete as it stands right now. It's only going to become more and more complete because they can roll their way to the Dnieper the way they're going right now. I believe the game changer in this war has been the Russian Air Force and the Russian aerospace forces in general, with their numerical advantages. No amount of F-16s are going to change that because they're just simply not capable pilots compared to Russian pilots. Again, you can't train somebody for 3 months in a simulator and tell them to go out and fight people that are battle hardened. That's complete insanity. So this is where we're at. And until our next commentary, I'm sure there will be more information that we'll be able to put out based off of what we're hearing from the Telegram channels. Thank you very much.